Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the Slave Dwelling Project. We are privileged to have Mr. David Britton from Tennessee, and his title is Changing the Narratives at 2 Tennessee State Parks. So Mr. Britton, I am going to turn the mic and everything over to you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks for joining me here today. Again, my name is David Britton. I'm the park manager at Dumbar Cave State Park in Clarksville, Tennessee, and Port Royal State Historic Park in Adams, Tennessee. Both of these communities are roughly an hour north of Nashville. Most folks know where Nashville is. I've been with Tennessee State Parks for probably about 15, well, yeah, not probably, actually 15 years this last month. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey through embracing the idea of telling a fuller narrative, changing that narrative, and kind of my experience in that at the 2 parks that I manage. So I've been the park manager for these 2 sites the last 4 years. And to give you I guess to make all this make better sense, we're going to go over a little bit of the site's individual history as protected sites to help us understand a little more about the process of changing this narrative. And so, again, we're talking about Port Royal and Dumbar Cave. That's what we're going to refer to them in short instead of using their full park name to this whole thing. And we're so. To describe both of these places to you, as I presume few of you, if any, have been to either, they're 2 of the smaller Tennessee state parks. You know, the Tennessee State Park system is just that. It is a system of 56 different parks that is comprised of historical sites, natural areas, recreational experiences, and what we would call rustic parks, your kind of traditional place you go camping at, hiking at, and that sort of thing. So because of that, we have a very diverse set of skill sets behind all of these places. So Port Royal specifically is the smallest Tennessee state park. It's 30 acres, and it is a historic site through and through, and it preserves and protects a small or the remains of a small tobacco town. Actually, you know what? I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to try to show you guys. So let me actually do that, because y'all probably rather look at that than the illustrious Dumbar Cave archive behind me. So let's do this. Okay. Okay, can somebody tell me they can see that? So I don't think I can hear anybody, but okay. So actually, we'll start with Dumbar Cave. So Dumbar Cave is 140 acres. Today we preserve and protect a very unique Mississippian Native American site. Mississippians are the ancestors of a lot of the southeastern indigenous people today, as well as some folks that have their roots more in the upper Mississippi Valley. It is the only place in the nation where you can experience Mississippian cave art. It has pretty remarkable examples of cave art that date to the mid-13th century. And by using these, and of course, these are emphasized for your viewing over this platform. We use these examples of artwork to educate the public about the bigger world of indigenous life here in North America. And to emphasize that indigenous people are people, and not something that you just see on old Westerns and so forth. And so for a lot of people, this is their only really meaningful experience with indigenous culture. We'll talk a lot more about the partnerships with indigenous descendant communities to interpret this sort of thing. This picture inside the cave where the artwork is with rangers shining a light there on it. And annually we take somewhere about 7,500 or so people through the cave to experience this cave art. Port Royal State Park, to go back around to what we were just talking about, the smallest Tennessee state park, is a state historic park. It's on the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. We preserve a small tobacco town that was founded in the 1790s. And dark fire tobacco is the linchpin of this region of Tennessee and Kentucky as far as its agricultural production. Really, the PowerPoint is there just to provide visual emphasis. So there's no information necessarily in these PowerPoints. But if you decide you want it, shoot me a note afterwards. I'm glad to send it to you. Sound good? Okay, so back to Port Royal, we preserve and protect about a 300-yard section of the preserved Trail of Tears inside the park. Again, part of the National Historical Trail. And most of our programming revolves around interpreting entire stories that involve indigenous communities on the Trail of Tears, and of course the enslaved population that made the town of Port Royal function. Again, it was a tobacco town. So I'm not going to get too deep into all that, but I want to give you an idea of where we're at today, what we do today. But this has not always been so. For those of you, and I presume most of you have in some capacity worked at a historic site. And so that means that all of you probably understand, that your interpretive quality, your interpretive themes are usually always shifting to some degree. But, if you compare what it is now to say 25 years ago, it should be significantly different, right? So this is certainly the case with both of these sites. And so I refer to these as the traditional narratives. The traditional narratives at both of these parks, Port Royal to start, focused on a covered bridge. This was a structure that was built in 1904 and fell in 1972, and then was rebuilt in 1978 when the park was opened, and that became kind of the centerpiece of the park. And I kid you not, the original planning documents for the park used the term old-timey feel. That was the purpose of the site, was to provide a small historical site that would preserve old-timey stuff around this covered bridge. And so this bridge fell in 1998, which created a whole lot of other issues of what do we do now? And that's been something difficult to combat. And we'll get more to this in the very end. We're going to talk about challenges. But I just want to explain how this narrative has shifted a lot. At Dumbar Cave was established legislatively as a natural area. It was only made a natural area because they thought it was too small to be a full park. There's nothing very naturally significant here, according to the standards by which we establish natural areas today. But the traditional narrative for the site of Dumbar Cave is primarily a white narrative. It's one that revolves around the big band era and Dunbar Cave being used as a music venue in the area in front of the cave. And then also following that, the Roy Acuff period, when the country music superstar Roy Acuff owned Dumbar Cave and utilized it as a country music venue. And so even today, we have a substantial population of the local community in Clarksville that associates Dumbar Cave with their Friday nights growing up, or their Saturday afternoons. And so all that to say is that nostalgia and local memory play significant roles in the way that these traditional narratives were formed. We also have to acknowledge, though, that those traditional narratives are mostly formed by the people that are in power in any given community. And so we'll get to the again, talk about that more with in the context of challenges. And so, what's interesting though is that with both of these sites, the significance or potential significance was recognized by involved planners or scholars at the get-go. Dunbar Cave was established in 73, but by 78, there was an archaeological dig that uncovered a remarkable prehistoric significance occupation at the mouth of the cave, from 15,000 years of indigenous communities. And it almost became an archaeological area, but politics got involved and it became what it did. Even Africana Town, which we'll mention a little later, is a freedmen's community that was at Dunbar Cave, was seen in the record, the mention of it. It was mentioned in the interpretive plan of, hey, this might be important, but nothing was ever done with it. So if we're not doing anything with it, we're not, what does it matter? Port Royal, the Trail of Tears obviously was well known and documented, but the first park brochures until the mid 1990s called the Trail of Tears the Old Indian Trail. Still placing it within that context of white settler old timiness. So why is this the case? Why was it largely ignored? And so I tend to blame this on the lack of meaningful long-term scholarship. And I know, I've seen some of you in the list here, I know that you are scholars, and so I'm sure this resounds with you, is that if a site is set aside 40 years ago and inadequate planning was offered at that time, that as it moves forward with no scholarship, it only takes sometimes minutes to be behind the eight ball as far as historiography. And so, again, by the time you get to 40 and 50 years later, if you have not adapted, if you haven't changed, if you have not engaged in scholarship, you are left with a stagnant story, frozen in time. But then also, I think we have to acknowledge that ignorance is part of this too. It's a product of the national perception of the place of race in our collective story, whether that's our story as Americans or our story, in my case, as Tennesseans or Clarksvillians in this community here. And so obviously, non-white history wasn't, and it isn't in a lot of communities accepted, except for, academic circles. And of course, that only reinforces the status quo. And so those are the things that lead to the preservation of those traditional park narratives. So I just realized earlier that I can't actually converse with you. So I was going to ask you this. So let me ask you then rhetorically, why is the narrative, if we talk about the narrative as a thing, why is the narrative important? Why is the overall overarching message, as opposed to not caring about it but still delivering individual inclusive programming? Why is this overall narrative important? And feel free to throw something in the chat box if you have something. But I like to think that the narrative is important because it reinforces power structures, right? This overall narrative, what we accept as Dunbar Cave's original story here. So instead of Dunbar Cave was discovered by Thomas Dunbar, a white Scots-Irish explorer in 1782 or 84. And he, carved out the wilderness, and built a blockhouse and fought the Indians and that kind of thing. Because when that's our narrative, how does, we have 15,000 years of indigenous occupation at the mouth of the cave. How do we fit that into that? And so I want you to think about, and again, I don't think I have to tell any of you, but examine why is the narrative important? We want to ensure that power structures are diversified, that they're inclusive. I just saw where Mr. McGill said that we think we met at Traveler's Rest. We did meet at Traveler's Rest, I guess a couple of years ago now. So let's get to how has this narrative changed? And I would suggest that it's too easy to think that changing a narrative is simply, well, we just need to come up with good programs, right? We just need to come up with inclusive topics. And that's part of this. But I propose that has to be the product of systemic mission-based change in your organization, in this case, in my staff at my parks. And so again, this is not just as simple as talking about inclusive subject matter. And I want to say that where this starts is it has to start in you. It's imperative for each of us to examine where our hearts are at. This is probably the hardest part. This is the finding and rooting out racism, bigotry, and hate in every form that's in your life. And if you think that you're impervious to it, you're not. This has to be an ongoing process. This has to be something that becomes part of who you are. Because if you're going to be teaching about inclusive narratives, if you're trying to change this narrative, if you're trying to change the larger social narrative by what you're doing at your park, or at your site, or at your institution, you've got to be in it, and it's got to be happening inside of you. So what preconceptions do you have that you're not acknowledging? Where does your privilege lie at? Are you acknowledging that? Are you dealing with that? But it's part of all of us, and we have to reckon with it. The other thing is recognizing the power of public history in the form of activism. I'm not going to define public history because I think y'all all get that, but recognizing its power as a form of activism. So here's a quote from Hayden White. Hayden White wrote The Burden of History in 1966 and states, "In the world in which we live daily, anyone who studies the past as an end in itself must appear as either an antiquarian, fleeing from the problems of the present into a purely personal past, or a kind of cultural necrophile, that is, one who finds in the dead and dying a value he can never find in the living. The contemporary historian has to establish the value of the study of the past, not as an end in itself, but as a way of providing perspectives on the present that contribute to the solution of problems peculiar to our own time." This is essential. This is the so what question, right? It's very easy for many of us that are interested in history, have our education in some form of history, to allow that interest to kind of supersede the power of what we're capable of doing with proper interpretation and inclusive narratives. So this comes down to leadership. So if you're a leader, how are you leading in your institution and in your agency? Your team looks to you to set this example and the expectation. If you're not in a leadership position, there's a thing we call leading from behind. How are you setting this example amongst your cohort and your colleagues of self-examination and recognizing the power of what you do as activism? So I'll go on to say with leadership that management of a site matters tremendously. So whether we're talking about, like in my case, I have to deal a lot with conflicting use, active versus passive recreation. Is the public identifying and using your site for uses other than it is intended for? Does that detract from your overall mission? it's essential that your decisions as a manager are reinforcing what your inclusive mindset is reflecting this mission that you have. Otherwise, the public will define it for you. And I've worked again with the public for 15 years at this point in a lot of different capacities, and you have to be continually, actively defining what this place is for in order for it to really be effective in the long term. So again, this is probably what the third time I've mentioned this. Scholarship is essential. You don't know what you don't know. Now we're talking about inclusive narratives, subaltern histories. You're not always going to find that in the archives. You're not always going to find that through a Google search. So engaging with scholarship is essential, and I think that is something that a lot of sites miss. That we're either not hiring educated historians or we're not, contracting educated historians. You need people that are capable of finding these subaltern stories. And if you think your site doesn't have Black history, if you think it doesn't have Indigenous history, you're wrong. It does. I guarantee you it does. You just have to look harder. And that takes sometimes a special skill set to do that. But then one thing that I've learned a lot about through some other partnerships is your community does matter. So when you're looking to include these groups in your community, whether it's the African-American community or an Indigenous community, look to them for those stories, because you would be surprised how many of these narratives are still preserved within their oral tradition. And it's extremely worthwhile following up with that. So all this kind of comes under mission. You have to have a clear and concise mission. It's essential. If changing the narrative and developing inclusive programming and ensuring that when we say our heritage or our collective story, that's really referring to everybody, that's got to be part of your mission. If it is not part of your mission, you're not going to do it in the long run. You've got to have a form of accountability, and that's what a mission does, right? It gives us that guiding light, that line to follow, that map, that compass, and it helps us make decisions along the way. Partnerships are also immensely essential with this. Do I look like I need to be making decisions about how Black stories are told? Just to be frank, right? I'm certainly not Indigenous either. Bringing these communities in to help you develop the stories that need to be told, the way they need to be told, and with the buy-in of those communities, you can't put a price on that. At Dumbar Cave, we have we're in, I'd say, the beginning stages. We're about 4 years in, but the beginning stages still of relationships with the Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. By bringing them in to, first off, here, this is your part of your story. I want you to experience this. I want you to feel at home here. But what is it that you want me to tell the world for you? Because I'm in a position of being a steward, much less than a superintendent, right? I'm in a position of being a steward. And if I'm a steward, it means that I'm trying to make decisions that best have the best interests of this resource and this story at heart, and by default of these communities. This is what led to partnerships with History Before Us at Dumbar Cave to develop the stories of Africanatown, the Freedmen's Village that laid here in front of the cave. At Port Royal, it's been developing partnerships with Benevolent Lodge 210, who happens to be the only remaining descendant community of Port Royal, not just of the African American community, but of the town. This was a town that was supposedly considered for state capital in the 1840s. And there's nothing there today. These people at the Benevolent Lodge in Mount Zion Baptist Church, they're interconnected, can trace their ancestry to the enslaved people who came here as workers and craftspeople in the late 18th century. That's incredible. And they have a vested interest in protecting the stories and telling the stories at Port Royal. We partner with the Cherokee also at Port Royal to tell the story of the Trail of Tears, to ensure that we're engaging the public with difficult stories, stories that people, that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so that leads me to talking about interpretation. Interpretation has to provoke to be useful. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Freeman Tilden's principles, 6 principles of interpretation. And one of them says that, information for information's sake is just that, it's just information. Interpretation takes information and uses it to provoke a response from your visitor. Now, traditionally in parks, that's often in the world of conservation, right? We're provoking an emotional response in a visitor to ensure that they consider recycling when they go home, or making the decision to purchase an electric vehicle, or making the decision to allow their lawn to grow, and that kind of thing. In the world of a historic site, it's a little different. We engage the public with very difficult subject matter. Indian removal. It's one of the darkest stains on United States history. And so we have to do this because our job is not to reinforce racism and toxic masculinity and toxic ideas of nationalism, or to provide comfort even, especially not to provide bad history. We want to provoke dialogue. A historic site should always be a place of intellectual engagement that takes place in meaningful and impactful ways. There's a NPS, National Park Service, civic engagement study that makes the statement that parks should not just be, and I would say not just parks, but any of our sites, should not just be a site of recreation destination. Recreation being very broad here, right? Museums, parks, mountain climbing, whatever. So not just recreational destinations, but springboards for personal journeys of intellectual and cultural enrichment. When we engage people with difficult stories like Indian removal or the story of slavery in this local community, and we don't pull punches about it, and we are going to elicit a lot of different responses, a lot of different emotions. Some people get angry. I'm sure all of you can attest to the reactions that visitors have to you dispelling, the good slave owner myth, or the Cherokee didn't have any other choice. It was best for them, or whatever. When we provide meaningful interpretation in that way, we provoke these highly emotional responses, but it's essential that in this process that you're providing safe space for these people to have those emotions. My partner and I discuss frequently how what we sometimes call dumb questions or stupid questions are sometimes somebody's attempt at feeling out the realm of how this question is making them feel. And it's important that we allow them the space to do that. And so that's what we do in this interpretation. Now, I'm running short on time here, because I think Frederick wanted to leave some time for some Q&A. There are challenges in doing all of this. For us, one of the biggest challenges has been community memory, nostalgia. Nostalgia is not always history, but nostalgia is not always bad either, right? So that's one thing I want you to think about in the case of your site, is that how people are used to experiencing a site can be an albatross around you. But, is it still part of that site's history? When we talk about an inclusive history, it's about creating a whole story, a whole picture, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. And so for us, it creates a lot of very difficult decisions sometimes, because Dunbar Cave, for instance, could be perceived as having competing narratives. There's a predominantly white narrative. There's a predominantly indigenous narrative. And then there's also this newer that we've just found, predominantly African-American narrative. How do these things interlock into a cohesive, inclusive story? And that comes down to your abilities as an interpreter and as a site manager. You're also going to encounter resistance to talking about non-white stories. Fortunately, here in Clarksville, we have a fairly progressive community in that it's attached to a military base. And so there's people from all over the world that live here. And but in smaller communities across Tennessee, when you are to bring up something that doesn't focus, maybe doesn't reject, but doesn't focus on the predominantly white story, you can be met with a lot of hostility, So it's essential that you are towing your line. You are standing up for the story. Also be real about what you might represent. Do you think me dressed like this has a positive effect the very first time that I walk into an African-American lodge? It's one of the hard parts about being a Tennessee State Park Ranger. We are also law enforcement officers. And that was my first experience. And obviously the lodge was incredibly, hospitable, but the tension was very warranted and noticeable. It was actually Mr. McGill a couple of years ago at Traveler's Rest. I brought that story up to him, and he was like, "Have you thought about not wearing your uniform?" Duh. And that led to better relationships down the road. First time I met a Cherokee archaeologist that we work with frequently here at Dumbar Cave, I made the statement just by simply making the statement to him that, I recognized what I am here, that I'm a white guy with a badge and a gun that's saying, hey, I'm the person protecting some of your cultural legacy. How could that not make him feel at least awkward? So being real about that opens up so many fantastic doors in those relationships that are truly essential. Be real about what you might represent. And I think you'll be surprised about what will happen in those relationships. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with what I tell children on programs where we go to the Trail of Tears. We do a variety of programs with local camps and schools and stuff where we take them on the Trail of Tears at Port Royal, and we talk about Indian removal. And after they've learned the story of the Trail of Tears, they've learned about this was the product of federal policy, on and on and on and on. I tell them that each of you have superpowers. And I hope you believe this, because I'm talking to every one of you that are watching this. Each of you have superpowers. You have the ability to change the world and the future. Well, how is this done? Well, we talked about changing narratives. I think ultimately, though, it comes down to treating others with kindness and love. Seems pretty simple, but it's something a lot of us are not very good at. We tell others about the stories that we've learned. And so I tell these children, tell other people about the Trail of Tears. Tell other people about the Cherokee and that they're still here today. Tell other people about the stories of enslavement. And that's it. That's all it takes. It's one park at a time, one program at a time, one person at a time, one heart at a time. And in my experience, that's how narratives are changed. But you're also never, ever, ever, ever done. So that's all I've got. Thank you. And I think Frederick, I don't know if he's in here, was going to open up for Q&A. There we go. So Stacy has asked, may I ask how you arrived at this place? Was it self-education, formal education, or other? Are there resources you recommend for educating site personnel? A lot of this has been self-education. A lot of this has been attempting to be mindful about the situation at hand and coming to conclusions of it through it that way. But then also, I am in the MTSU graduate program. That's Middle Tennessee State University. And that program places a very strong emphasis on social justice through public history, working for and working with subaltern communities. As far as resources, I cannot suggest anything off the top of my head, but I know I have, there are several books. You might look at some of the publications by AASLH. That's the American Association of State and Local History. They have several fantastic publications on talking about difficult history. Linda has asked, has there ever been any thought given to changing the name of Dumbar Cave? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's been a discussion that we have had with Cherokees, and we're open to it, but we're not sure what, because we don't know of any name that it would have been called. So perhaps there's even more innocuous names we could call it as well, but that certainly has been in discussion. Me personally, I hope that that's something we could achieve one day. And Meredith says, thanks for helping bring lessons to the children. Absolutely. All right. I'm also curious if your site has experienced pushback from locals, governmental or community, and how have you dealt with it? Surprisingly, we have not experienced a tremendous amount of pushback that I can't handle. There's always pushback when you're a government employee. So I've got a pretty thick skin anymore. Most of the pushback, in our case, revolves more around folks not being able to utilize the site in the same way that they did before, whether that be able to have weddings at the mouth of the cave. That was a decision we made that with the input of indigenous people that, utilizing the mouth of the cave for other experiences kind of diminished the sacred nature of that place, or at least, it kind of created dissonance in what we were saying, and so we get complaints, but complaints are complaints and they go away. We've not had any government, like local government, try to intervene and change something yet. I should say yet. I'm sure it'll happen at some point. So. Mostly again at Port Royal, we deal a lot with kayaking and canoe traffic on the Red River. How do we manage that and reduce that traffic to allow places for people to come and experience these programs in the historic site itself? And so we deal a lot with those types of engagements, which can be tense. So, but having a thick skin is highly recommended.